Welcome. Welcome to our third webinar. I'm Maria Jaschok, chairing today's session, and I welcome you also on behalf of my co-conveners, Toby Levin von Gleichen and Comfort Momo, both of you who you will know through their publications and their activism. And it's a welcome those who joined us from the start 3 weeks ago when we began with our series. And welcome also to those who are newcomers, and hoping you'll stay with us right into December. We have a 10-week webinar series, and we conclude with our 10th webinar right in December. So all of you, well, welcome again, and we are so glad. It's so good to have you with us. Having said that, well, it's not ideally what we thought would be the case. We are relying on Teams software instead of face-to-face conference, what we ideally had hoped for. And Teams has certain quirks, certain eccentricities. Most importantly, it doesn't allow for this most direct interaction with the audience. So, as a colleague of mine put it, an obnoxiously fidgety sort of piece of software. And I do maintain it cannot have been designed by feminist software engineers. Absolutely impossible. It lacks that interactive and kind of receptive quality. So we have to ask you for your forbearance, and please hang on if there are occasional pauses and silences. And also, because it's not possible to have direct interaction, please, throughout the presentations, write your questions into the Q&A box, and these questions will then be moderated by Toby, who will be overseeing the Q&A session. Now, this is not only the third webinar, it is also the third session within our first panel theme that dealt with themes of democracy, populism, and the coronavirus, and also their impact on FGM. Those who've been with us since the first webinar will sort of remember the keynote speech and the defiant call for robust action on FGM given by our keynote speaker, Leila Hossein. But it was also the first webinar that featured a panel that raised questions about around issues on the global nature of FGM, the difficulty of engaging cross-cultural research, but also the context in which local movements can effectively operate. And last week, we then listened to presentations on FGM within the different contexts of affluent multi-ethnic, Singapore, Nigerian migrant women's experience in Italy, and to a success narrative of disrupted tradition of girls' disempowerment in the Maasai context. Today, the webinar develops two different but also interdependent topics. One that looks at the role of the state, at political will, and the other that features the importance of a multi-voice education in volatile contexts. So the first half will be devoted to the case to be made for the establishment of position of an FGM commissioner. So why is it the time for an FGM commissioner? These are practical responses to feminist issue. The first presentation will be given by Dr. Joseph Home, an honorary research fellow at the University of Salford School of Health and Society. So Joseph, if I can hand over to you, you have a good 20 minutes. So if you can sort of keep us in that time, that would be greatly appreciated. So Joseph, you're eagerly anticipating your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I'm just trying to share my screen now. Sorry, my screen's not sharing particularly well.
Yes, sorry, we ask for your forbearance. It's going to come in a moment.
Sorry, my apologies for this.
Are you getting there, sharing?
I think so. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Fantastic. So sorry about that. And so my name's Joe. I'm a junior doctor. I work in Greater Manchester, and I was lucky enough to start working with Professor Rowland, who's been leading this work with the University of Salford. And this piece of research is some research we did over the last few months and years with Felicity, who's also on the call, and Charlotte, who's also on the call as well. I won't take any questions throughout the presentation, but please feel free to send me any questions to this email address you can see here, or I'll be available at the end for the question and answer session as well. So, female genital mutilation, just for those of you who aren't aware or who aren't familiar with the practice, is something that does happen worldwide, and it's not constricted to any particular culture or any particular country. And there's cases of it happening across the world, spanning across multiple continents, countries, and different legal boundaries. It's done in medical and non-medical settings. So in some countries, particularly countries where it's not, there's no legal status of it, it's not illegal at all, it is still done within a medical context. The estimation from UNICEF is there's around 200 million women and girls living today who've survived FGM, and it is illegal in the UK. The immediate complications from a medical perspective, obviously I'm a doctor, so that's the thing I know most about, are the obvious of bleeding, infection and pain in the first instance. And there have been several cases where unfortunately women and girls have died due to the bleeding they've suffered, and because it's not in a medical area that is very difficult to access help if the bleeding becomes uncontrollable. In terms of the longer term physical and mental health complications, there are several of these, including pain on intercourse, frequent urinary tract infections, general chronic pain, and permanent urinary incontinence. And this is obviously made worse but by the fact of some of the mental illness that comes with it in terms of PTSD and so on. As I mentioned before, so Felicity is going to speak more about the law around this, as she's the lawyer. But the first piece of legislation around female genital mutilation was the Female Circumcision Act in 1985. This was superseded by the FGM Act 2003, and when the Serious Crime Act in 2015 came in, this was amended to allow for the invention of FGM protection orders. So FGM protection orders, or FGMPOs, are an instrument used by the family courts, and they don't actually directly criminalise families. They try to be to increase the accessibility and reduce barriers to applying for them. That they don't directly criminalise families, but they're designed to be quite broad and flexible. And if they are granted, the judge granting them can put on several conditions around them. And FGMPOs work similarly to forced marriage prevention orders and antisocial behaviour orders. They work in a similar sort of way. So it isn't until you breach the order that there's any criminality at all. So examples of conditions with FGMPOs are things like mandatory medical examination, surrender of travel documents, banning the children from travelling. And this is all a means of preventing and protecting women who've been seen to be at risk of FGM. So what our research did was we aimed to evaluate and review what the use was of FGMPOs and other legal instruments in preventing FGM happening in the UK. And the way we did this was we compared data from the family courts and the Crown Prosecution Service to data that we got through NHS sources, that's NHS Digital. And within the UK, if as a health professional, if I suspect that someone has undergone FGM or is at risk of undergoing FGM, then there's a mandatory obligation to report that to the authorities and have that recorded. Which means that, in theory at least, this data is quite robust. Every person working within the health service or in the education sector or within social services has a positive obligation to add to this data if they think that someone's at risk. And what we did was we compared the data from 2015, when FGM prevention orders were introduced, to 2019, which is when our data set finished, again compared to the family courts. And as you can see from this graph here, so the smaller number, 22,500, that's how many individuals are thought to have undergone FGM within this time period and presented to health authorities. So just to note that this data doesn't include anything from education or social services. This is just from health. So if they present to a general practitioner, a community nurse, or to a secondary care, so a hospital in England. The larger number, this over here, is 45,950. So this includes this number. However, if any of these individuals attended twice, then that's why this number is higher. So that suggests that out of all the individuals who've undergone FGM, their average attendance was roughly 2 times, and the reason they've attended has been primarily related to the female genital mutilation. That's what this data suggests here. So when we looked at that and compared it to the amount of FGM prevention orders that had been applied for and the amount that had been ordered, this is the numbers that we got. So these are the numbers you saw from the previous page. So a total of 22,500 individuals are thought to have suffered FGM in this time period. In the same time period, 408 FGM prevention order applications had been made and 489 prevention orders had been ordered. Now, the reason that this number is different to this number is that the family court can decide to apply more than one order for every application made, which is why this is slightly more here. However, as you can see, the number of applications is vastly different to the number of individuals who've suffered from FGM. So if you thought the law was coherent and robust and that everyone who suffered from FGM could have had a prevention order put in place, then you would hope that this number of 408 would mirror somewhat closer to this number here. It's also important to note that during the same time period that 2 offences were charged using the FGM Act 2003 for female genital mutilation being committed. Of these 2 offences, there was 1 successful criminal prosecution. So again, this suggests to us that out of the 22,500 individuals who've suffered, the law is not really doing as much as we would like, and it's not been effective in protecting and preventing this for these women and girls. So what we would suggest, and Felicity and Charlotte will talk more on this in a moment, is the creation of a National FGM Commissioner, and there is precedent for this. So what we have here is a picture of the Victims Commissioner, the Children's Commissioner, and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and these are all well established within central government at the moment, and these are individuals whose role it is to oversee the national strategy in trying to alleviate some of the risk that that individuals are under. So what we suggest an FGM Commissioner would be useful for. One thing to note as well is that when we've had these discussions in other forums, several people suggest that FGM actually does come under these existing roles. And you can quite easily argue that FGM would come under the Victims Commissioner. FGM could come under the Children's Commissioner, as a significant proportion of people who undergo FGM undergo it as children. And as within domestic abuse, as lots of this happens within a domestic environment. Now, there's several reasons why we think that this probably isn't adequate, and one of those is the fact that the numbers as stated on this slide suggest that whatever's happening currently is still ineffective in preventing FGM, and in order to really protect people, we need to change things. And if these different roles already encompassed FGM, which arguably they do, then they perhaps aren't able to give it the adequate resource that it requires. FGM itself as well is a very difficult topic in that it's entrenched in cultural and social beliefs, which mean lots of people find it difficult to interact with on a legislatory level, and that historically that's been talked about as one of the reasons why it hasn't been prosecuted. So when we talk about an FGM commissioner, what we propose is that they evaluate the data in a similar way that we've done and look at some of the pitfalls and how we can work through those, developing a national strategy of how we can really help to promote the health and safety of these women and girls. We also talk about examining some of the discriminatory aspects of the current legislation. So with regard to the one successful prosecution, there was lots of headlines about torture, witchcraft, and lots of real negative slurs across the tabloid newspapers. And actually, this didn't serve any purpose other than to further discriminate against people and create a really entrenched way of thinking about FGM. Something that is not helpful for the victim themselves, that's not helpful for the parent who was involved in that case. And also we suggest that an FGM commissioner needs to be empowered to intervene. So when they do see things wrong with the data, when they do see problems in terms of the discriminatory aspects, they have given the power to make decisions and the power to intervene on those things. The papers that we've published around this so far, just for further reading, are just here. But I will pass over to Felicity now, who will hopefully be able to talk a bit more about the ins and outs of how the law works in this area.
Thank you, Joseph, for this very informative presentation. It presents us with a very stark picture here of the disparity between, the number of FGM sufferers and the enforcement of law or legal provisions, because it's not as if that law is not in place, but is the political will there. Addressing the legal issues is Professor Felicity Gerry, QC. Felicity is the International Queen's Counsel located both in London and in Melbourne. Felicity, if I can hand over to you. Can you unmute?
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction to our research. I think it's really important to prioritise the health aspects of FGM, and I want to talk not so much about what the law is, but how our examination of law in the context of health has moved us to the idea of an FGM commissioner, because the suggestion of that as an outcome can sometimes be thought of to be just another quango and nothing else is going to change. And I think what we've found during the course of our research is that the combination of law, health and education can be really meaningful. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story, I suppose, which is the story of how Andrew Rowland and I got involved in this aspect together, and Charlotte, and then Joe, of course, has joined us at a later time. Now, many of you will know me as the person who published an article in The Guardian that said it was time for a criminal prosecution. and that was in, I think, 2012. And that arose because I wrote a book called The Sexual Offences Handbook, which set out all the law on sexual offending. And I contacted the Crown Prosecution Service and said, why don't we have a sexual offences prevention order, which is intended to be an order to assist in preventing risk, so that we can have a system whereby people can be on an order where a child is at risk. Is there such a system for FGM? And as a result of that, the Crown Prosecution Service asked me, through the Association of Women Barristers, to give a lecture on what the law was. And it was really as a result of that I then joined the Bar Human Rights Committee. Together with Charlotte, we produced, and a number of other people, we produced a report for the Bar Human Rights Committee, and that was part of the consultations before the amendments to the FGM legislation in 2015 that brought in the FGM prevention orders, protection orders that we're talking about now. So at that stage, if you were thinking nearly 10 years ago, we're thinking about, well, does the law protect all children? And there were lacunae in the law for children who were resident but not necessarily citizens in the UK. The law was a very blunt instrument, just looking at prosecution rather than FGM prevention through protection orders. So the idea of protection orders was that these would be not criminal laws, but family procedures whereby a child could be protected because those putting them at risk would be the subject of an FGM prevention or protection order. And of course, it might empower families to stand up to communities if they were under community pressure to say, well, we can't do this, we're subject to an order. We're now several years on, and what we've been able to do through the data, and Joe's given you the sort of lack of effectiveness of law, is just to consider whether or not these legal mechanisms are sufficient. And I think the short version is not only are they not effective, but there's also very little buy-in. In the relation to criminal law, the one successful prosecution, we call it successful, but I'm not sure it is. It's successful in the sense that someone was convicted for female genital mutilation on a child, but that someone was a mother with a really hefty sentence, which was clearly designed as a deterrence, but actually causes all sorts of issues for a mother and child and a family. And more importantly, the context of that criminal prosecution was the use of the language of witchcraft and evidence in relation to witchcraft. And the sorts of approaches to a criminal prosecution we haven't seen since witchcraft trials in the 19th or earlier 17th century. So the woman was vilified in relation to the witchcraft, and witchcraft then connected to FGM led to those brutal and discriminatory headlines that we saw in relation to that criminal prosecution. So in my view, it wasn't really successful because it perpetuated those discriminatory attitudes, particularly towards women. So an FGM commissioner in the context of criminal law with the power to intervene and say, well, hang on a minute, if witchcraft is relevant to the FGM itself, fine. But if you're just talking about witchcraft towards the police officers who are investigating, what does that really contribute to the process of criminalising female genital mutilation, and where we don't necessarily criminalise other public health issues? Next, we looked at family law, and obviously the way in which protection orders have been used by judges has been highly critical, particularly of women in those procedures, and putting mothers in particular under significant pressure, so that the effectiveness of FGM prevention orders are not in place because there is a lack of engagement both from professionals and individuals affected by FGM, because it is seen as so draconian. Instead of protective and preventive and having those forms of engagement that were perhaps anticipated, it has become a pretty blunt tool in a system that is not terribly good at recognising feminist and discriminatory issues. In immigration law, for example, the approach appears to be a sort of demand for a medical examination before immigration can be considered, and some really gender-based discriminatory attitudes within the immigration field that Charlotte was going to talk about. And I'm sorry Charlotte's not here, but summarising drastically her research in interviewing women survivors of FGM, she discovered a whole heap of discriminatory attitudes towards women. So an FGM commissioner that can look at the data around criminal investigations, family law approaches, immigration approaches, training of judges, understanding of gender issues, suddenly starts to seem a place in which to draw together these themes of protection, prevention and prosecution that arise from FGM, and then drawing together the health research in which there clearly an enormous number of women and girls affected by FGM in the UK, that the legal process is first of all, data is not being collected, and you can look at our papers. For example, the police were collecting data on the basis of assault other. So it went into a category of assault other if there was a complaint about FGM. It didn't even go into a specific category of FGM, which it now does. So data collection really poor, and real concerns around engagement with health. So what we looked at was, and I'm sure Joe can chip in if I get this wrong, but we looked particularly at areas where health has been effective together with law. So the examples that we've given in previous presentations are smoking and seatbelts. We want people to stop smoking because it's very bad for their health. It's a public health issue. You can make as many laws as you like, but it's the public awareness and the health issues being aware by the public. There's this sort of upstreaming, downstreaming system whereby law together with a health message seems to have had a significant effect on the number of people who smoke. Now, people still do, numbers are not down, but data is collected and the health issues are better understood. Seatbelts. There was a time when none of us wore seatbelts. I certainly remember standing on the front seat of my mother's Fiat 500, sticking my head out of the roof and waving to the passing cars when I was a young child, and that was thought to be fun. Ridiculous. But in my lifetime, people have understood that the safe thing to do is to wear a seatbelt. So there are ways in which health combined with education, combined with law, have reached positive outcomes through public engagement. And those are two examples that don't carry those real issues with discrimination. Discrimination towards particular cultures, to colour, to women, and therefore there is that extra aspect to the connection between health law and education. That is this problem with significant and severe at times discrimination that led us to consider that this is a specific aspect that needs an FGM commissioner, not just to have someone with a hat and a title, but someone who is capable of going along to court hearings, making written submissions, engaging with judges, creating educational tools, assessing the educational tools that are already being used. And there are some really, really effective educational tools that are being used in schools by many of the campaigners, particularly Hoda Ali, in this space. So how all of these very different service providers, whether we're lawyers or educators or health experts or counsellors, all of these aspects could be considered by an FGM commissioner who can collect data, evaluate that data, look at where there's engagement, see where the discrimination aspects happen, and actually make submissions about that. So in my head as a criminal lawyer, the one example I'm going to give you is I would have liked written submissions on the witchcraft issue from an FGM commissioner in that criminal trial to say to that prosecutor, the defence counsel, the judge, hang on a minute, before you go down the witchcraft route, let's just have a look at what this would do to women generally. That this may be a specific prosecution of this woman in relation to her child, where the real issue is, did she fall off a kitchen top onto a cupboard, or was she the subject of a dangerous attempt at female genital mutilation. That's what the issue was. Do we really need to go beyond that to look at issues of witchcraft in relation to police officers? And that's just the one example of where we could start to say, well, hang on a minute, in front of a family judge, before you start criticising these parents, perhaps this order could be used as a way of encouraging parents and gaining support of communities. And we consider at the moment, from the research that we've done so far, that that's a really good place to be. So I wanted to give this presentation against Joe's background to remind us that this is a health issue, that there are all these complexities around that health issue, that wouldn't it be lovely if we didn't have to criminalise a health issue, that there was sufficient public awareness for this to disappear. But whilst we're in a space where the numbers are still really high, that combination of health, law and education is really important. So that's really all I wanted to say. I'm very interested in any Q&A. I do want to apologise, but I've actually, I'm not going to be able to stay for the next presentation myself. And I think Joe's probably in the same boat, that it would be easier for us to take any questions if there are any now. I've actually had a message that I've got another meeting coming up soon. So I apologise for that, but if anyone wants to ask me any questions now, or if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, I'm easily available, easy to find. At my university address is at Deakin University in Australia, or my chambers address at Libertas Chambers in London. So I think that's probably long enough to chat, isn't it, Toby and Maria and Taylor? If anyone has any questions, I can't see any questions in the chat, but do feel free to ask me.
Okay, thank you very much, Felicity. Thank you very much, Joseph. Now, as it happens, we are still waiting for our other presenters to arrive. And also we have additional time because, as you already indicated, your third presenter, Charlotte Proudman, unfortunately was not able to come into this particular panel. In Israel, she finds the connection, rather fragile. As I said, right at the beginning, where are the feminist software engineers when you need them? That's not very, very good. So maybe if I could ask Toby then to sort of, start with this kind of immediate questions of Felicity, of Joseph, and that would give us a bit more time, and we can take time for another 20 minutes or so. Felicity, is that all right?
Yeah, I'm all right for the moment. Yeah.
And then, that gives us time to organize the next panel. So thank you. This was a very eloquent case you made, Felicity, for that position. But the question in my mind was, is there the political will right now for this, to happen?
I think the short answer is I don't know. I certainly know that there was an all-party parliamentary group on FGM that was formed before the pandemic. So I think there is some cross-parliamentary support for tackling FGM, but some real concern now that shouting about prosecuting people isn't necessarily what the stakeholders want. I think that was important 10 years ago in 2012 when we were shouting about, hang on a minute, this is still a problem after 40 years, women and girls are still being cut, let's make this law effective. 10 years on, the law is there and it's not effective. The way it's being used is not effective. So we have to think again. It's good to have the laws in place as I don't want to use the phrase backup. It's not really what we're saying, but it's good to have the laws in place to demonstrate that this treatment of women is sufficiently serious to be criminal, but much better if the law can be effective in preventing FGM. The actual outcome we all want is for FGM never to happen. Mm-hmm. So the law clearly can't do that on its own. If we accept that it's still sufficiently serious for it to be a crime because of the way in which women and girls are treated, then we need to move to a point where that crime is not happening. FGM is prevented. And I think the health aspects, the understanding of the health aspects, this isn't just about women's reproductive rights, it's about women's right to the highest attainable standards of health. And what we heard from Jo was how FGM affects women's health so significantly, that this is about women's rights to have sufficient health. And so some of the examples that again, this is a practical paper, and I'll rattle on a little bit. Some of the examples that we came up with were, and Jo will help me, but if a woman presents at a general practitioner with a cold, let's say, I don't feel very well, I've got these symptoms. Nowadays we'd go for a COVID-19 test, but that comes back negative. You say, I'm not very well. I reckon there's no data collected in the sense of the GP saying, right, well, let me go through all these. Have you got this? Have you got that? And the GP will be doing an assessment. Jo can help us as to what they consider this person might have. You know, have you recently been abroad? Have you been bitten by a tick? You know, there might be some random ones in there. But that's a normal question, isn't it? Have you recently been abroad? Might you have a fever from abroad? Why not, if it's a woman, say, have you been the subject of any form of episiotomy, whether that's female genital mutilation or episiotomy after having a child? Because if there are problems with the women's genitalia, that can give rise to flu-like symptoms. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that if every woman was asked that, we'd all get used to being asked about and say, oh, you know, that's a bit odd. No, that's not me. Well, hang on a minute, I have had labiaplasty, might be the answer. You know, it's not my answer, but it might be, somebody might say, well, yeah, hang on a minute, I did have labiaplasty. Or, yes, I did have a episiotomy after one of my children, and I hadn't thought that that might be it. I've had this recurring cold for 6 years. That's just an example of where the collection of health data could be better if we understood it as a question of women's health, and that collection of data in that way might give rise to an indication that there might be a need for an application to a court for an FGM protection order. Hopefully not. The person could be educated, nothing would happen to their children. And similarly, when a child is born, well, you've had a child, you're a survivor of FGM yourself. Do you intend to, I don't know how those questions, it's not for midwives to collect evidence, and I don't want to put words into anyone's mouth, but can we work out a mechanism whereby midwives could carefully ask a question of every mother at the point that they're having a child, whether there's any history of FGM in their family, without assessing their culture? If it was a simple question that's on a tick box form for every single woman, those are ways of collecting data that appear to be non-discriminatory, providing they're set up in the right way. And the third example I had was a personal experience, which I often tell because it's quite funny. But I got old enough to have what they call a well woman check. I live in Australia. I'm currently in England and I work in both places. But I got so old, they told me I had to go and have a sort of women over a certain age well woman check. And my goodness, the questions, they were very intrusive. So intrusive, it was hilarious, you know. And if I'm hoping you're not too sensitive, but, you know, do you take it up the bum? Have you had an affair? All these sorts of really, really interesting. It was hilariously funny for me. I didn't mind at all. I have no issue about it. I answered them all. I'm not going to tell you what the answers were. But the point being, we got through this long list of my sexual behaviour, my husband's sexual behaviour, and not one question about FGM. And it struck me that that was really important. And I said to the midwife, well, hang on a minute, you haven't asked me about FGM. And she said, oh, no, it's not on the form. And she said, but I have seen one once. And I said, well, what happened? She said, well, I took a look and I thought, oh, that's a bit different. And I just carried on and did what I normally did on a well woman check. And that was the end of it. So she didn't ask any questions. She just thought, oh, that's new to me, and carried on. And I said, well, don't you think it should be on the form? And she said, yes. And then I was invited to speak to all the family health doctors and practitioners at every level, not just doctors, health practitioners, midwives in that area of Australia. And apparently they put it on the form. I don't know whether they do the tick box exercise, but they said they were, and they said that this made a difference. And I thought that was the most important thing I ever did. Never mind all the lectures about the law. But the point at which I was then asked to speak to people and say, for God's sake, ask every woman, wherever they're from, have you had FGM or an episiotomy or labiaplasty, then it will collect the sorts of data that allow us to analyse where there need to be responses, not just let's phone the police and have a mother investigated about her child. So that's my very long answer to that that question. And I think because those examples demonstrate how much it is law, health and education, that really is what makes me think there is a need for an FGM commissioner. That's why I've reached that conclusion based on our research. But I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Joe. It might be easier if you explain the upstreaming, downstreaming thing. That
yeah, Joseph, would you come in, please unmute yourself?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Felicity.
That's all right. It's just I thought it was best to do it by way of a bit of a chat today. But in terms of the complexities of health, I think it's better coming from Joe. Thank you. I'll mute myself.
Cheers. Thank you, Felicity. So, in our most recent piece of work, we did a large bit of work on what an FGM commissioner would be as a public health intervention. And within academic public health, there is concepts known as upstream and downstream interventions. So an example of a downstream intervention would be a grassroots sort of frontline educational intervention, you know, working with people who are known to be at risk of FGM or have undergone FGM on a very specific and individual basis. And an upstream intervention would be, an example would be a change in legislation. So a very broad brush type approach, which hopes to stop anything happening downstream. And the metaphor about upstream and downstream is that there was several people trying to cross a bridge, and they're all falling off this very, very slim bridge. And people are there trying to repair the bridge and stop things happening. Whereas upstream, someone just closes the dam, and you can close the dam and save all of the unnecessary hurt. And it's actually a more effective in terms of the resource allocation as well. Now, when we were looking into this and doing some research, the evidence actually suggests that while downstream approaches really help individuals on an individual basis, as a population and as a society, they don't do a huge amount. And that's because if you manage to identify the individuals at risk, then you can help mitigate their own risk, their personal risk, but you really miss out on most of the people who are in that risk category. And you'll help that individual for that period of their life, but what you won't do is you won't really challenge the cultural norms and values that an upstream one would. And when Felicity spoke about the change in seatbelts and smoking and laws around salt and sugar consumption are the same in terms of public health, but what that does is when these things are introduced, there's often a lot of pushback, and the pushback tends to decrease over time as people grow up in a society, in a situation where that's the norm for them. So for me, it was the norm to grow up in a society where seatbelts were mandatory, and now to me, not wearing a seatbelt seems a bit silly in a car, or taking up smoking again seems a bit silly. But 20 years ago, that would have been against the trend. So if you introduce these upstream methods of public health intervention, these tend to have better longevity and better. They tend to touch all members of society sort of equally. Now, the ideal approach would be to have a blend of both upstream and downstream. However, we were always working in a resource-sparse situation in terms of health and social care and educational interventions. So if you had to choose where to put your money for one particular intervention, we suggest that something like an FGM commissioner, which would look at how to effectively develop upstream interventions, would be the best means to do this. But that's not to say that your grassroots movements for these things are also very, very powerful, and on an individual basis, can be absolutely essential in getting someone through a very difficult period related to FGM, or likewise preventing it from happening in the first place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Toby, if you do you still have a moment, both of you? Toby, if I can bring you in, please.
Am I in? I think I'm in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I'm there. There appear to be very few questions from participants, but I do have some that I think are relevant. I was intrigued by your advocacy of law, health, and education joining hands, but I think an ingredient is missing, and it's a very expensive one, but also an obviously effective one. It's advertising, and so that you need a significant budget and the genius of those who are in the business of altering and influencing attitudes and behavior in order to get their hands on this particular issue.
Yeah, I think I can probably jump in there. I think I don't know that it's missing. We perhaps didn't use the word advertising here, but by public awareness, if we can think about, clunk click, I think was the old seatbelt thing. Some of us might remember clunk click every trip. Joe clearly won't, he's clearly not old enough. But we had to learn to put our seatbelts on. We had some very simple, now you'd have memes on the internet, and I often, when I'm teaching students law, I get them to write a meme about something. I did it on human trafficking recently. Could they do something about the law? So it's another reason why we thought an FGM commissioner was good, because you could have disparate public messages. Often you can't even agree whether it's FGM or FGEC, or that the language around FGM is difficult because there's a lack of agreement amongst experts. So that's somewhere where an FGM commissioner can be quite important, to try and understand what a wide public message could be that would not of itself be discriminatory. So there's quite a lot of evaluation to do. And of course, yes, I agree, it has to be a wide public government-backed campaign, because like the seatbelt advertisements that we've seen, they're very graphic now. We see advertisements of young people dying in road traffic accidents that are really shocking. And one hopes that FGM public awareness would not have to reach that level, that you would have to have shocking images. And certainly I don't subscribe to putting images of children. Certainly even articles that I've written, the newspapers have added images of children that I find very uncomfortable. Yes. So I think there's a lot to be done around the advertising. And obviously, for my part, those headlines, the witchcraft headlines in relation to that one prosecution that makes me consider it wasn't a successful prosecution at all. You do need to battle those types of headlines, and that's really what we're trying to do. And you have to start with the research, so you've got a solid basis for making a suggestion. Making a suggestion like FGM Commissioner is immediately confrontational. It can have people say, well, why do we have to have that person? Who do we want? The way in which the law has worked in the past has been to actually be very draconian towards us. The systems that we thought would be protective are now very draconian. How is an FGM commissioner going to change that? Won't an FGM commissioner just make that worse? That communities will be under more pressure. So it's something that would need buy-in, and therefore would need to be of itself have its own publicity, that it's not intended as draconian towards communities. So I think you're absolutely right. Messaging is, in the modern world, is the most important thing, but this is an area where messaging is very different depending on, and the way in which FGM is done in different communities is very different. So a person with the main role of collection of data and evaluation and ensuring non-discrimination, with this sort of upstream downstream aspect to it, I genuinely think is a way of saying, well, hang on a minute, providing it's done in a way where we say, hang on a minute, we're not doing this very well. And that's the one that I think is the tough one. those on the ground are clearly doing things very well. More broadly, it's not working so well.
Right, right.
How do you get there?
I'm sure you have something to say on to this question, which may be brief.
I'm never brief. Sorry.
Right. No, that wasn't my intention. The comparison to France. That the French have been, as far as I know, the only nation that have consistently and over 2 decades successfully prosecuted, with the result that in the Ile-de-France, in the area around Paris, the PME, the girl protection in institutions, that's the health unit, have measured a significant decline in the number of FGM cases. It comes up in my experience as a question again and again. Why has England had one successful prosecution in all of this time, and France has had such considerable success?
Yeah, look, I've not done the research to compare. And I think my reflection is that I think that is bound up in the word successful. Whilst I think it's a success that there's been a reduction of numbers in France, I don't know whether that's necessarily all attributable to the legal mechanisms. And I don't know whether the legal mechanisms at the beginning were as draconian as ours have been when they had their first successful prosecution, if you want to call it that. I wonder whether actually they were in the same position as England and Wales, in the sense that it was done with regard to the crime rather than the wider aspects of women's health rights. So I think it's important not to speak outside my field of research, our field of research, but I don't think that alters the way in which we've approached our research. That maybe the answer is that an FGM Commissioner could look at and evaluate why it is that France has had that reduction in numbers. I don't know that I would approach it with why has France had more prosecutions, because in my opinion, you want to get to a point where there are no prosecutions because nobody is cut. So if a commissioner were able to look at it on the basis, why has there been this reduction in numbers, then there might be some learning to be had. But I think we got bogged down with, let's have some prosecutions. Now we've had one, it didn't go particularly well. Let's have another look at what else we can do. That doesn't mean take away prosecutions, make sure that's still there. Because from what I said earlier on, we still consider it to be sufficiently serious an attack on women for it to be criminal. Let's not take away that sanction, but let's look at how we might be more successful in prevention rather than prosecution. I don't know if you've got if you know anything about France. Can I just ask Joe before you do, whether Joe knows anything about France from a health perspective? It's a good point.
No, I don't particularly. I don't really know how the French health system works, but I would echo your point, Felicity, in that, you know, we could have a response of a reflex kickback and say we're going to really push prosecutions. But actually, if we did it in the same manner that the previous one happened, and that case was all over the tabloid newspapers, and it really did drive in stigma into the whole idea of FGM. Often what that will do is will just stop people from going to health services and stop people in their biggest time of need really going and accessing the care they need from health services if they think that it's going to end in that sort of situation. Because you've got to remember, although, as Felicity said, that they've committed a crime, these are still often families and daughters, and the last thing you want to do is have a daughter who's had FGM happen to her not visit a hospital when she desperately needs to because she's worried about her family being convicted. And I think that we really need to be careful about calling for more prosecutions just with a blanket sort of ruling.
May I come in and ask both of you a final question, because I know that your time is very limited, and before we move on.
Yeah, sorry, and I have to say, someone else, I cut someone off a moment ago, wanted to jump in, so
Yes,
I'm
I
keen
was
to
going
hear
to
that.
jump into
Yeah.
that, Felicity. So no, my final question is that this is also very much a political project. And whilst you very persuasively have argued the case for this time, you know, to have arrived that such a post should be set up, I'm also wondering about the time in which we are living, that is the time of the pandemic, its impact in particular on, you know, many people here of color, of minority population, the sensitivities around the greatest impact on people of African, Asian descent, if the virus has been particularly difficult. But I just wonder whether you have sort of considered the difficulty of making the case at a time when these sensitivities are to the fore, whether that makes it more difficult or somehow easier to make that case. Yeah.
Oh, look, there's a long answer to that one. I think I'll try and do it as shortly as I can. I suppose some dot points, if it helps. That first of all, I think everything relating to women and race is pretty much on the back foot during the pandemic, and I think it's very difficult to raise issues for women. I think women are significantly affected by loss of work in the pandemic. I think these are serious problems for women, and advocating on women's issues during the pandemic, very, very difficult indeed. In context of race, obviously we have the messaging around deaths in custody, deaths of people in the context of protest and the George Floyd issue. But actually, look, when I was in Layla Hussein's wonderful documentary, The Cruel Cut, I was the person that said, look, if this was white vaginas, we'd have been talking about it a long time ago. So that's a very short phrase and a bit of a soundbite that encompasses so many things that arise in relation to race and discrimination around FGM, that somehow it is still perceived as something that they do, in this, as black people are sometimes somehow something other, and it's simply not true. And you know, I worked with a master's student at one point who'd done quite a lot of research around labiaplasty and the sort of surgery that's conducted across colours and cultures, that isn't necessarily a traditional form of FGM, but remains a form of FGM. So in the current pandemic, I think getting these types of complicated issues, not just in front of government, but with cross-party support, is the hardest thing to do. And where there's not going to be much budget for anything, the suggestion of an FGM commissioner is not going to be their favourite suggestion. But I think the idea of approaching it from a health aspect does grab politicians. If you can take the messaging in a different direction, they do understand seatbelts, they do understand smoking. It's more complex in FGM because of the discriminatory aspects, but it just reinforces what I think, that actually women's rights to the highest attainable standards of health in any context, but here specifically FGM, really is the message and shouldn't be ignored by politicians. So I think it's a way, suggesting an FGM commissioner is a way to get these complex issues back in front of the politicians who need to make a difference. So look, if we're not successful in having an FGM commissioner, it would nonetheless reach the attention of those three commissioners that we identified earlier in the presentation. So I think that's my position at the moment. We've obviously got more research to do, and all of this is based on, I've given you some personal stories, but all of this is based on research rather than personal stories. So I think that's how I feel about it. Carry on doing webinars and being as noisy as we can during lockdown, and hope that when we come out of lockdown, there's a bit of appetite for change. I do have to go now. I've got another meeting, but I was conscious I cut someone off, and I would like to hear that person if she's still got a question. There's someone who wanted to jump in.
Yeah, we have the Q&A box, so questions will enter that box and they're stored and archived. So nothing will be lost, and we'll sort of forward whatever else emerges in the second half of our webinar.
Lovely. Well, I'm really sorry I can't stay to listen to the other half. I hadn't quite realised the timing for the other presentation, so I do hope the other presenter will forgive me for not being here. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Felicity. You asked for loud voices, and I think you made that kind of contribution.
Yeah, I'll keep shouting, you know. And whether or not anybody agrees with me, I think that's right. And I think Joe's going too. So thank you, Joe, for giving up your Saturday too.
Cheers. Thank you all.
We're turning Joe into a feminist.
Yeah.
Felicity, thank you very much.
Not at all. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
See you too. And we are now turning to the second half of our webinar. And I see already Professor Michal Moskow here. And I have to thank Professor Michal Moskow and her collaborator, Fadumo Iido Mohamud, very much. Because of the difficulty of timing, Professor Moskow had to get up at a sort of unearthly hour to be there with us. And
an academic.
Greatly appreciative of that. And we're sort of now entering the field of education, but education in a context of crisis, of turmoil, and specifically related as to Somalia. And there's a reason for that. Professor Moskow is a professor at Metropolitan State University in Minnesota, and is working with Fadumo, who sort of, as she put it to us, her current project aims to incorporate teaching about FGM into her work. And I don't know if Fadumo will have the time to sort of talk a little bit about herself and her experience, born into a refugee camp in Ethiopia. But this is, as I said, a presentation on a focus on education and the need for a multiple voice narrative, an education that can work only under certain conditions. A city in turmoil, people at risk, Somali immigrants in Minneapolis, FGM, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, inclusion of all voices in designing education programs. So Professor Moskow, if I can hand over to you again, with thanks for your heroic effort this morning to do it.
I apologize. My alarm didn't go off. My phone was turned off and I didn't realize it. And I had a text from Fadumo that she's getting sick, which worries me because rates are going up enormously all over the U.S. and especially in Minnesota. And she works in a school, and they now no longer have the kids coming, but she has to go to work every day and she's with other people. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. I have another Somali student who had 2 cases in her family.
Oh.
I'm so sorry. We are sorry to hear that. Please convey our very good wishes to her. I'm very, very sorry to hear that.
She's really disappointed. She's been looking forward to this so much, and she's worked for quite a while. So the background is that I was teaching in Sweden for 16 or 17 years, and that's where I first had Somali students because of the war in Somalia in the early 90s, and then went on from there. And after I moved to Minnesota, I was asked to be on a board called Somali Family Services. It operates in Puntland in Somalia. And the director is Somali. He's Somali American. He's applied for citizenship. I don't think he's going to be able to come back, and he has a green card. And they do quite a bit of education work on voting, as Somalia got a constitution, and they also have a lot of education on their community radio on trying to eliminate FGM. He says that it's much more prevalent in the rural areas and among nomads than it is in the cities. That's probably true, but there's still a really high rate in Somalia, 90 to 95% is what we hear. And although often when I ask statistic questions, I'm told nobody knows. It's a nomadic group, you know, and people move around. And then I also have been working as a monitor in immigration court in Minnesota because the cases have been pretty horrific. most of the ones I've seen have been Hispanic men, but there have been some Africans, including Somali, and it's discouraging because they're picked up for things that I have not been picked up for. Speeding on a road with a back light out, I've never been stopped for 3 months, but there was a black man, African American, who was shot by a policeman for less than I do, and with his girlfriend and child in the car.
Yeah.
So it's been quite traumatic, and this has happened several times, unfortunately, in Minnesota recently, because in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is where we are, it's pretty liberal. The police is a big problem. That's a big problem, but the politics are fairly liberal. In rural Minnesota, I hear it's much different. And so what we did, and I also have to say that I've been in criminal courts, and people can get out on bond pretty easily. The minimum amount for immigration court is $1,500, and if somebody's locked up, they're not earning money, and they can't get out. And the papers all have to be filled out in English. It's really quite a mess. But so what we started doing, I did some interviews in Kenya based on Hillary Bridge's questionnaire with some modifications, and followed that up here. Our intention was to have both group interviews and individual interviews in Minnesota, but then of course everything got shut down because of COVID. And so there's not a lot of new information to come out of these interviews, I don't think, but it started a bigger conversation, I think, especially in St. Paul, but in Minneapolis too. And she was a student assistant in a class I had where we were connecting with students in a university in Somalia, and we've been working together since then. And I went before the last presidential election. Minnesota has caucuses, and now they have primaries too, where you vote for the party member or for the party, but they have caucuses, which I quite like. You went and you voted for the candidates, but you also could raise resolutions. And I put forth a resolution that parents, where FGM has been done to girls, the parents should not be jailed because of family disruption and because the girl's going to feel like it's their fault. And this was voted down unbelievably, except by one neighbor of mine who knew what I was doing. This is based on a court case a couple of years ago where two different families from India and the Twin Cities took their daughters to Michigan separately. And there was a medical doctor there who was doing the procedures, and it went to court, and she lost her license and couldn't practice. She is practicing again now, as I understand it, because it was ruled to be unconstitutional, and there need to be new laws in Michigan. This was in Michigan, but the families were from here. So there was a fair amount of interest at that time, but there's not generally, partly because, while some immigrants in general, there are something like 75 languages spoken in the St. Paul public schools. So immigrants in general are pretty prevalent in the cities, but it's difficult to get information from Somalis for good reason, because of harassment from the police, and what's gotten much worse with Trump, of course, is the anti-immigrant. Official estimates are 35,000 in the Twin Cities. What we really hear is more like 75,000, the largest group in the U.S. And then when COVID-19 hit, the governor put into guidelines, but you know, this is the U.S. What can you make a law? And everybody has to protect their freedom. And there was almost a stop on going for medical appointments unless you thought you had COVID. And in fact, I had pneumonia, and the only clinic they'd let me go to was one where they also treat COVID patients, and I was terrified it would go for a month, so it lasted a bit longer. Now they've opened up clinics again, but the rates are higher than they've been. And so no one that we interviewed had needed to contact a clinic. We had been curious as to how medical visits are affected by COVID, and we know, although again it's not documented, that incidents of FGM are going up with people being there. There are all sorts of weird things happening because people are getting what they're now calling COVID fatigue. But you know, we couldn't meet in person, so we decided to do it on Zoom and see, well, this also gives us a chance to see if the interviews work on Zoom. And actually, I was surprised at how well they went. Fadumo found all the people we talked to, so they're mostly younger people, and they're into technology and are very open. The women and the men we talked to are very open about talking about it, which kind of surprised me as well. And then there have been tensions between African Americans and African immigrants because of the difference in the slave background. And so two communities don't necessarily, not all blacks are the same, in other words. And then George Floyd was killed by a policeman who knelt on his neck. And there were demonstrations, and then these turned into riots. A lot of the rioters were coming from outside, and apparently they just go around to demonstrations causing problems. A lot of businesses were burned. A lot of the ones burned were small ones that had been started by immigrants. And then Black Lives Matter became very active and is so far remaining active. And this is, I think, the first time in my memory that I can think that openly Black organizations are saying they're glad that whites are joining in the protest, because we need outside, they need outside help and support. And we found the same in asking the people we interviewed about talking about FGM and getting help. And then of course there's been this disruptive atmosphere and this stupid presidential campaign that's really frightening. Because we could, well, my friends in Africa say it's beginning to sound more like African countries. It's, it is. So we went to virtual interviews, and they were all individual. Some people didn't want to talk on Zoom, some did, and Fadumo, as I said, found the people we interviewed. They were all Somali Americans, some of them born here, some of them born in Somalia or in refugee camps in Ethiopia or Kenya. And some had, been taken with their families to Kenya and set up businesses, not in the refugee camps. So we had, there were more females than males, but we did interview males. I did in Kenya, and we did as well here. And most of the ones here were between 20 and 35. There was one older woman, 46, and I'll get to her. That was actually Fadumo's mother, and it was quite a touching interview, I think. When we asked about awareness, they were aware of it, but some of them less so than others, because if they were born here or if their families began opposing it after they were born, they didn't hear as much about it. And apparently any ceremonies have pretty much stopped among Somali when they have it. There were in the past more, but they now just do it, and that's all. And the girls are left alone for about 2 months to heal. So attitudes of men, Fadumo found in talking to a lot of young Somali men that they said they would not want to marry a woman who had had it done, which kind of surprised me. There was one we talked to, and I'll bring him up periodically. He was an outlier. Do you want to tell me when I need to finish?
Yeah, that's fine. You go ahead. You're okay.
Tell me when should I stop?
Oh, you can take another 10 minutes.
Oh, whoa. Okay. So he thought that it was good that women wanted it because it was good for their health. The rest of them didn't, and the reason it wasn't discrimination. They didn't want to marry the women, but they'd heard about how much pain they had in childbirth. A lot of the families who supported it first had stopped. Fadumo's mother had it done, and she had it done to her 2 older daughters. Then Fadumo was the third, and it was just a cut. She said it was still quite painful and uncomfortable, but and then with the younger girls, they didn't have it done, and her grandfather also wanted it stopped. So this is a family that's had it done, and excuse me. And when we ask about asylum, whether they should qualify for asylum, this came from that case years ago, Toby, where you were going to testify in court.
Yeah.
In the US, and they all, except for the one man, they overwhelmingly said they thought it was a good case in which to grant asylum. We also, I'll put up everybody that we ask, how should it be dealt with, and they all said, I should get up my PowerPoint. They all said that it should be dealt with and it should have input from the wider community, because without that it wasn't going to stop. Mm-hmm. And we know, as I said, that it's being done here. Can I share my screen now?
Yes.
And I'm going to flip through these really fast now since I was so late. So this is a drawing that we showed people before.
Oh,
they.
So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Do you want to just hit that down arrow at the bottom to share your screen? We just haven't had it appear yet.
Sorry. Yeah, I got to get back into Teams. Yep. Okay. So we showed them a drawing before we interviewed them and asked what it looked like, and people would say a girl in a forest, maybe there's a hand supporting her. When we asked them again after the interview, and these are all people who, some of them had had it done quite horrendously, and some of them had not, but they all saw it differently. As a woman who felt trapped, who couldn't get away, the hand was holding her in place. And so even how they interpreted the picture was a bit interesting before and after the interview. I've used this method before when I've talked about immigration. And there's a big difference there because a lot of people simply don't know the problems with immigration in the US today. And so we thought we'd try it here with slightly different results, but they were actually similar. And the trees are rather threatening, some of them thought. So we did that. And then Fadumo has put together a brochure with the help of another student for design that is with this picture on the front, that's partly educational and gives some online resources, and it's 2 pages front and back and at a triple fold, and shows local resources in the Twin Cities. What I'm still looking for are some doctors, and I know there are a couple that I met probably 5 or 6 years ago whose contact I couldn't find, who work with women. One of my former students has a mother who's a interpreter in labor and delivery, and she would come home with horrible stories about women giving birth who had type 3 or type 4 especially gone and done, and my student didn't even know if her mother had had it done or not. She had not. Mm-hmm. But and what Fadumo is going to do is place these in mosques, and this is another thing that surprised me. The mosques here are, the imams and other leaders are very supportive of getting rid of it. Mm. And, when we asked where could people go for support, almost everybody said to a mosque, to an imam, to the leaders, to the male leaders. These are the ones that stop it. And so she's going to be putting these in schools and in clinics and wherever people come in the mosques as well, the folders, and as something of a start. And whether we'll put it in university or not, I don't know. Right now it's we aren't having any classes, and so there's not much point. There are little notices in all the restrooms, women's restrooms, about help to go for sexual violence. Mm-hmm. So and she's putting together also an education component, and she's hoping to go back to the refugee camp in Ethiopia where she was born and lived until she was, I think, 11 or 14, I can't remember, and do education there as well as here. She's very, very committed to this. What we had hoped to do, but I don't think there's going to be time, is to read the interview between her and her mother. And I just found it so touching. And she said that they connected so well. It was done in Somali. Her mother's English is pretty minimal, and so I was going to read the mother's part. But the 2 older girls were born in Somalia. They had it done to them, and they moved to the refugee camp in Ethiopia. She had it done but less so, and the younger girls not at all. And her mother was quite open. I don't know if she's literate or not, but she spoke quite openly. And then Fadumo said that what had happened since then is that she and her mother have always been very close, but they've never talked in depth about her mother's background. And as a result of this, Fadumo started asking her more questions about her background, where she comes from in general, what kind of a life she had. And as I mean, now I hope it's not COVID. She lives in a house. She probably is a major wage earner. Her mother's never had a paying job outside the home, but there are I think about 8 little children in the home. And so they are at risk, unfortunately. And
Michal, may I ask perhaps because we do have a little bit of additional time, to read us something, from the interviews. I think that would make it very real.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So her mother said she was around 8 when she first heard about it, which was when it was done to her. By the age of 8, you were considered mature and have to undergo the surgery. I only heard about it because the aunties of the community were informed I was ready for FGM and I had to prepare for it. And she had to have her hair cut. She said you had to have your hair shaved before you got the cutting, which was every girl's least favorite part. But we did it because every girl was getting the cutting back then, and it was considered cool. Any girl who couldn't afford to get the cutting would get bullied by other girls and be called shameful words because it was seen as a shame to not have the cutting done as a young girl. All the interviewees we talked to, when we asked about economic impact, they all said only to the aunties who did the cutting or to the fathers who got a bigger dowry. And let me see, and they talk some about how Fadumo was a very brave child. She used to want to run around without a shirt when she was little because she said, I don't have boobs yet, I don't have to wear a shirt. And so her mother apparently had difficulties with her, but also enjoyed it. She liked it because she was so outspoken. And Fadumo refused to come to America unless her mother got her a particular new bit of clothing. And they would laugh when they were doing this. Her mother said, you were very difficult, but you were smart. You knew how to get away with things and get yourself out of trouble. You were great acting. I'm surprised you didn't major in theater or something, but you always talked about being a teacher since you were a little girl. And Fadumo said, I've always wanted to teach the younger generation and pass down my life experiences and lessons to people who may learn or be inspired by it. I've learned a lot from you. And her mother said, well, get back to the topic of halalan, which is the Somali word. I know you love hearing people say good things about you. And her mother said, I was not educated about FGM back then, and so since it was a cultural norm, it was only right to let them get it, or else they would have been made fun of by the other girls. When it came to you and my youngest sister, your grandpa refused to have you girls get the extreme halalai. And Fadumo says, I remember being ready with my aunt, who was about the same age, and sitting waiting to go through it with our hair shaved. But when we heard it was not going to happen that way, it really did not make me feel relieved or anything, because I didn't know what the difference was or if there was a different kind of level to it. But as an adult now, whenever I have conversations with my school childhood friends who got the extreme cutting, I'm so grateful that I was not a victim of that. I'm not missing half of me or having to worry about not feeling anything during sexual intercourse. As I said, I was quite surprised at how outspoken some of the young women were. One of the girls back in Cabribaya, which was the refugee camp, said that she feels she's missing half of herself, that she got taken away from her without her consent since she was so long. And her mother said, she's right. You feel scared about being with a man or giving birth when you went through the extreme cutting, and so to feel a part of yourself missing is normal and can be hard to adjust that feeling because there's nothing you can do about it. And as you grow older, you start to think about the people that were involved and the aunties who supported the cutting of genitals for little girls, and you start to feel angry and blame them. But the truth is, they were as clueless as I was back then. I didn't know the harms and complications that come with it until I got it done and grew up and learned about it more. The purpose that FGM was performed was because the elders did not want young girls to be sexually active or to have a sexual drive that would cause them to have sex before marriage. Growing up, I thought it was part of the religion that every girl must get the cutting, but the religion, meaning Islam, does not support the extreme kind, nor does it make any kind of halal line mandatory. And Fadumo goes on to say, I'm glad that young girls today will not have to suffer, especially in refugee camps, because of course the medical care there is very, very minimal, if any, too. And she asked her mother if she thought people still did it back in the refugee camp. Her mother said, no, I've not heard anyone getting it done. And every time I call back home, I tell them not to do it to the little girls, and I try to educate them from here. So this is her mother doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And Fadumo says, once I become a teacher, I will for sure teach the subject of FGM and the negative impacts it causes women. And her mother is saying, I would love for you to get back to your homeland and educate those. And a fair number of Somali before COVID in Minnesota were saying they wanted to go back, and they are going back and starting businesses and schools and health centers, are going back and forth. So in a lot of ways, they are much more international than most Americans are, especially in the middle of this big country. Mm-hmm. And Fadumo said, what would you advise the 8-year-old you if you were to go back in time? Her mother said, I would advise her not to worry about what the others doing and to always follow her guts. If something does not seem right, it probably is not. I remember you as a little girl getting in trouble for saying things that normally would not be shared by girls in general, and for always doing what you thought was right, which was one of the reasons I never stopped you from speaking your mind. Trends will always come to an end eventually, so you should always do what you think is right and share any knowledge you may have about anything. No matter how many times society tries to silence you, don't be quiet. Listen, let every step you take be heard, and if I could go back in time, I would advise myself these very words and live up to them. And her mother also says, as you know, my child, I had a lot of kids and I gave birth to them during difficult times, and I had no medical help during birth. We had no ladies who helped assist. We had older ladies who helped assist, but no doctors. And not everyone can afford to go to the hospital since most people didn't have vehicles. Every cutting that happened during childbirth, I felt it because unlike here, there was no medication available for us to numb the pain. Imagine having to feel the pain of FGM all over again since they've cut you open in order to give birth. It was horrifying, and I would not wish that pain and vulnerability upon anyone. And then Fadumo says she's so sorry her mother had to go through this. And her mother then says, here's to a better generation that's more educated and more advanced. You will do great things, Fadumo. Keep studying and bringing awareness to things that matter and need more coverage like FGM topics. I'm proud of you. And so then they talk some more about some celebrations when she was a child. Her birthday was on AIDS, and her mother said, and she asked her mother about her birthday. Her mother said, I don't know anything about it. My mother died when I was little, and we just didn't do that. And so, and probably doesn't even know when she was born, because a lot of immigrants to the U.S. don't have birth certificates, so they're given, this may happen in New York, they're given the birth date of January 1st, and whatever year it's assumed they were born. Yep. Of course, birth dates are more important in this country than they are in a lot of places. So this is a conversation that I'm hoping she'll get put, it is, I think it's recorded, put into the History Center here because they collect oral histories, and we probably need to start some more awareness there of things on. And I mean, I call it, she's older because she was older than the other interviewees, but she's only 46 and she's had 8 children. That, you know, older women who had it done to some of their children and no longer would allow it to be done, I think could be a strong voice in terms of, if we want to call it advertising, right? I think raising awareness would be what we would probably better call it, and could speak in Somali with immigrants. So the next steps are that we want to do what people generally do with research. We want to do more data analysis, more interviews, give some conference presentations, maybe to the ESL Teachers Conference in Minnesota, and put together the education component that she'll teach, and so and some, you know, in some publications. So I do have our contact information here. I'm not sure about her email address because she hopes to finish in spring, and then she wouldn't have the university email address anymore. Step Academy is where she works. It's a Somali school, and the principal is quite open and quite, I've talked with him, I've met with him. I'm not sure why they're still having to go into work.